And so we'll start. So hello, present spirits, to the next session of Spirit, number 15, which is called Presence and Eckhart Tolle. The notes are on the screen being shared with you now. I'm just going to do a quick recap for those that are fresh and maybe entering the series on this video. There's 38 topics, 38 sessions, and I'm going to try and recap the first 15 in about 2 minutes. So in the first session, we talked about Hegel being the greatest philosopher because he was the one that summed up in a concrete totality 3,000 years of philosophers. The second session was that for the last 200 years, nobody really understood him because of one-sidedness. Session 3 was about once you understand him, it empowers your spirit to change the world in a practical way. The fourth session was about getting beyond the stereotypes of Hegel as a sexist, a racist, a totalitarian fascist, because that's only the first negation. The fifth session is about the second negation. And when you start with Hegel, you have to grasp something called the circle of reason to get past this one-sidedness. The sixth session was about how when you get around the circle of reason, it sort of looks religious at the end. Real philosophy is the sublation of religion, not just the first negation, because of a universal logic. The seventh session is about putting this universal logic into analytic notation, Frege's notation, to win a Nobel Peace Prize. The eighth session is about this logic starts with the first negation, which is the polemical moment. But the ninth session is about how we have the polemic of polemics as the truth of polemics. That is what sublation is, and that is what genuine refutation is. The 10th session was a masterclass called The Science of Logic that Hegel wrote on sublation. The 11th session was about how the profoundness of the science of logic has to do with ineffability moving itself. It's what religions tried to communicate, and that when we put this into notation, the Nobel Prize is not a joke. The 12th session of Spirit was about how this universal logic has to be a living logic, and the purpose of it is freedom. And the 13th session is that it's not just freedom for the individual, it's freedom for all of us because we're all infinitely valuable. And the 14th session was about how what Hegel really said was kind of repeating these huge claims that we're the children of God, religion. But the fifth session was that you can also look at this atheistically and reconnect to your inner child in a profound way. So this brings us to session 16, and I will read the title now and then the one paragraph summary to get us started. So today's is 16 SOS. SOS stands speculatively for Sessions of Spirit, but also Save Our Souls, because the pandemic has shown that we need a sort of a higher wisdom in the world to bring us together. The title today is The Amazing Profoundness of Everyday Logic and Eckhart Tolle. So let us dive into the essence notes. We're going to get into part 3 now. So yesterday or the day before in the last session, we left off by saying, okay, now that we sort of have this distinction between soul and spirit clarified in their right logical order in a philosophical way as the sublation of religion, what does that actually feel like? What is the phenomenology of this? What are we about to go through? Because as we go through the sessions, it's not just a theoretical experiment, I guess. It's a practical experience. Well, to be honest, it's going to look a little bit spiritual. And this is where Eckhart Tolle comes in. He says something like, the present moment is all we ever have. And the long and the short is that when you experience the true living nature of this universal logic that Hegel's talking about, you enter something called flow states. That's the modern term for what Eckhart is trying to talk about and what Hegel tries to talk about as well, where you sort of start getting this timelessness, this complete immersion, and a greater self coming upon you. So Eckhart is our modern sort of prophet or spiritual guru that's teaching us this. So who was he? Why are we talking about him and Hegel? Well, first of all, he was German and Hegel was German, but that's not why we're talking about them. He changed his name after a great theologian and philosopher, Meister Eckhart, from I think somewhere in the 1200s. Way back in the medieval ages. And he was studying philosophy, mostly language in the beginning. And he doesn't say anything about Hegel, which is interesting. Or if he did, I remember it was a very small thing. But I suspect that by studying Meister Eckhart, who Hegel also held in high esteem, these were sort of mystic philosophers. They grasped the nature of pure thought, but they couldn't break out of the sensuousness. And when I listen to Eckhart, he's sort of doing the same thing. He clearly has the universal logic, but it's only implicit. But he talks about how he got here as a child. And in the previous sessions, we talked about the importance of your inner child. It sounds naive, but really this living logic has to sort of heal you, because why we end up in this polemical moment with the world is because we have unsublated negations in us. And when you grasp this sort of universal logic completely, you reconnect to your soul, or the sense of who you really are. And then you bring that out in your spirit. And this is this kind of freedom that Hegel is aiming for. And in Eckhart's personal story, he sort of sets it up this way, where he's saying, I'm going to transcend. I started with this ego conception, this thing that my child made, and I got, all these abstract negations in me, and it made me feel like I didn't belong. So in order for him to become, to get the sense of belonging, he became an intellectual, and then he sort of arrived at this profound spiritual experience that we're going to cover with Hegel as well. Hegel covered the same lessons, but Eckhart distilled them into like 3 modern ones. So the first lesson we're going to cover is his principle of you are not your mind. The second principle we'll cover after this one, which is all you have is the present moment. And his third lesson, if we get to it today, is that you have to surrender to the now and sort of accept things as they are. That sounds naive, but there's a wisdom to that. So I'm going to blast through this a little bit quickly to try and get through it all in the next 30 minutes. But if you look at the first point of this first lesson, I put a quote. I say, can you be free of your mind whenever you want to be? Have you found the off button? So that's Eckhart talking. And he says, this is what kind of happened to him. He found out that he was caught up in these drives, and he found a way to turn off these thoughts. And Hegel says the same thing. He says this happens at the end of subjective spirit in his encyclopedia, where the pure I sort of develops its theoretical spirit above the drives, and then in its practical spirit, it starts to overcome them. It sublates the particulars of the drives, and then you kind of get this first experience or emergence of what happiness really is. That's not just this fleeting satisfaction in carnal drives or consumption. So Eckhart is kind of starting off in this place of the logic. He says these drives are bad, these particular thoughts are bad, but of course Hegel is a speculative philosopher. So there's 2 ways of thinking about the drives. The drives can also be said as the passions. When you're caught up in passion, you sort of lose control of yourself. Something else takes a hold of you, and you're not even free of yourself. You lose your freedom to yourself, your carnal desires, or whatever's in your soul, or whatever's in your subconscious mind, however you want to look at it religiously or atheistically. But there's also a right way. So the wrong way to have drives is these passions, these carnal passions that take you over, but there's a right way. And the right way is once you achieve speculative thought, once you achieve this sort of true philosophy, you rise above them like Eckhart is talking about, and then you can choose to intentionally put yourself into a particular. You can put yourself into a passion, and this is where you become world spirit to change the world. Okay, so in order to do this, though, you have to grasp things in the right order, and Eckhart is trying to do that. So Eckhart does have this logic in him, and he says the breaking point where he realized it was in this quote: if I cannot live with myself, there must be 2 of me, the I and the self. The I cannot live with, there's the self and then the I that I cannot live with. Maybe I thought only one of them is real. I was so stunned by this realization that my mind stopped. I was conscious, but there were no more thoughts. This is a critical breaking point. Like I just talked about, this is where sort of eudaimonia kind of comes in. But in terms of the right order, the logical order that Eckhart doesn't really talk about in his books, he talks about the phenomenology of it, but Hegel goes much deeper. He says, yes, there's the phenomenology of it, but he also explains the order of it. He explains how and why it happens as a proof that it happens. And this is the only kind of true logical proof there is. And so for those Hegelians in the room, what he's talking about in this quote here is that we sort of start off with consciousness, and then consciousness moves into master-slave dialectic, and then it kind of sublates itself into this universal self-consciousness. and we're sort of getting this idea of reflecting on ourselves. That's what self-consciousness is. It rises above consciousness, but most people conflate those two because they're not clear in the logic. What's the difference between consciousness? What's the difference between self-consciousness? What's the order of the two? Which comes before which? There's a lot of ambiguity in the New Age community, but Hegel sort of clarifies it. And he says, technically Eckhart is right, but there's something that Eckhart is doing that he's not really aware of. And that's that he's saying that this experience he had with himself is him shutting off his mind. But that's not technically 100% true. What he's doing is he's shutting off the finite mind. So it's always mind, you're still in your mind, but there's like two levels to it. And, when you get into this space of the I reflecting on the I, Hegel calls this the passionless calm of when you enter genuine philosophy. And when you're in the passionless calm, he's talking about that universal space where you're not pulled into your particular thoughts. So you turn off your particular thoughts, but you stay in this universal realm. Well, in a way, you stay in this universal realm to reflect on yourself. And this realm is a kind of timelessness. It's a spacelessness. It's an immanence. And it's actually the place where Hegel says the science of logic occurs. But Eckhart Tolle doesn't describe it that way because he doesn't have the explicit logic. He's just living it. He's present with it. But when you start embodying this, it sort of has this feeling to it that aligns with exactly how Eckhart talks about it. It kind of gets mystical and kind of gets spiritual. That's why I put this paragraph here for you guys to see how Hegel talks about it. We're not going completely non-academic here. We have to stay grounded in some rigor. So here's a paragraph where Hegel expounds upon what we covered in the previous sessions about the soul. He says, what Eckhart is really talking about in this progression is what I underlined here. He's saying, here's the awakening of the soul to consciousness. Here we give up the name soul and have not yet to do with spirit, but with the I, the abstract spirit, the soul, I, spirit. That's the order, the soul, I, and spirit. In session 14, we kind of talked about this is the profound clarity that Hegel has. He's able to say, he's not even just able to use these spiritual terms, but he puts them in their logical order and this kind of precise clarity that feels like as precise as science. And that's exactly what he's doing, but he's using sensuous symbols, religious kind of spiritual symbols. Here we're getting to more detail. We're saying there's not just the soul and then the spirit emerges out of the soul as the right order of the concepts. He's saying there's actually a middle one. And this is where Eckhart is pinpointing his story. He's saying there's actually soul, yes, but there's also the I and then the spirit. The I is between soul and spirit. When you hear me or anybody else talk about abstract spirit, that just is another way of talking about the I. It's the mode of consciousness before you sublate into self-consciousness. You're sort of stuck between your I and not yet spirit. You're not realizing yourself in an other. So it's a higher level of explication. You still have an object. What's considered an object is not you. An object is like not you-ness. It is not the I. It's like the opposite. So when you hear somebody talk about the object in opposition to the I, it just means the I doesn't recognize itself in the object yet. This is what consciousness is. You know there's something there, but you don't see through it yet. So Hegel's saying there's actually he's agreeing with Eckhart and he's putting it in logical order, and we're expanding on what we said before in a sort of spiritual sense, but also a scientific sense. You can read the rest of the paragraphs there if you'd like. He talks about how the soul comes out of natural soul and there's an evolution that continues. But the next paragraph I want to focus on, this idea of universality. When you enter this kind of timeless space of thoughtlessness, which is not turning the mind off, it's actually like pure thought. You enter this kind of concept Hegel calls universality. And the problem with ordinary thinking, and also what Eckhart kind of falls into a little bit, is we usually take the universal to be what's common between objects, but that's not universality. That's just the universal. Universality is how you kind of have this meta reflection of the universal reflecting on the universal. This is what the I is. That's why he says it's a universal for a universal. So to have universality, you have to have this kind of paradoxical thing happen where you're reflecting on something inside you, but you're simultaneously the same thing outside of itself. And then when you look at the universal, you see this kind of commonality in the universality. And this kind of strange thing happens with the object. The object suddenly belongs to this universality. It doesn't just stay outside of it. The I starts integrating, it starts sublating, and it starts recognizing that not only is the object belonging to it, that it is its object, but that it is its object in some way. The object is different from it, but then it sublates that difference and integrates it into a higher version of itself. So then it becomes this paradoxical, kind of mystical saying, the difference that is no difference. You hear mystics talking in this paradoxical way all the time, and you get sort of atheists and you get modern scientists saying these guys are kooks, they're making up things, they're sophists, they're playing mind games. This is not how the world works. It is a linear, rational, logical order. But of course, as we covered in the Frege sessions and the Tao session, actually the truth is it's linear in a sort of abstract way, in a formal way only. The truth, the concrete truth, is this more universal, this universality that reflecting on itself and constantly integrating what is other back into itself. Okay, so now we're sort of understanding the language a little bit more. The nature of reality is contradictory. It is this sort of mystical kind of way of talking, and Eckhart does this too. All the mystics do this, but the difference with Hegel is that he's going to show you the logic of why that still makes sense. And in fact, not only does it make sense, but it's absolutely fundamental to genuine philosophy. In the next paragraph where I underline it, he actually says, I am the whole, the pure, simple, and universal. And at the same time, I am immediately the opposite, an individual, a this. I am the resolution of this contradiction. Contradiction is not only something that looks weird and the mystics talk about, but it actually animates everything in the world. It is actually the logical, it's the dialectical force that causes you from taking what you think you know and staying there in this kind of stagnant unity, which if you stay there too long is a version of death. He says inside of any unity is its own contradiction, and its own contradiction leads it out of itself. You don't have to do anything. They do it themselves. That's why the science of logic doesn't need a thinker. Pure thought thinks itself in its own contradictory necessity. So this is what vitality is, and it's kind of what you start thinking like when you take the I and you start raising it to higher levels of consciousness, such as universal self-consciousness and then spirit. This doesn't unground you from reason. The philosopher or the atheist in the room, the higher levels of consciousness become more reasonable at the same time that you grasp this contradiction. So this is where you start grasping this eternal resolution in the contradictions. And it's not in this indeterminate, spooky way, which sometimes mystics are known for. They don't define their terms very well. This determinate existence is why Hegel is different. He actually determines how this happens. And he ends up saying there's this thing called Dasein. It's a kind of a special kind of being where you are this contradiction. And Heidegger, in the next paragraph, I'm going to mention him quickly for those philosophers that really think I'm out to lunch here. We want to put in some more contemporary philosophers so we can anchor where we're at here. Heidegger has this concept of Dasein too. It's this kind of form of being. What I believe is happening here is Eckhart's talking about Dasein as himself. Hegel's talking about it in its proper order as the pure I that's going to emerge out of soul and then emerge into spirit. And then Heidegger kind of comes in and says, well, they're all kind of happening at once in this kind of weird concept of Dasein. He's trying to get the speculative nature that Hegel is using, this contradictory nature of the world, and he's mashing it sort of into one term. And he's technically not wrong, but what you lose there is this kind of that logical clarity, that linearity that, the analytic philosophers want. Hegel's giving that to them in a circle of reason. That's how he's satisfying the speculative, the contradictory with the circular with the linear. So that's the speculative thinking. Both are happening at the same time, but you have to grasp things in their right order on the circle of reason, or else you're not going to make sense of this sort of simultaneousness. I think that is what happened with Heidegger. And it doesn't mean he's wrong. It just means it's one-sided. I think what has happened is in trying to clarify the pure I, he's conflating different types of being. So Hegel distinguishes them and shows that they're all simultaneously happening. Pure being is this general being which kind of evolves in the supersensuous logic, the science of logic, where Eckhart says he sort of emerged once he overcame the finite I. He kind of emerged in this world. And technically the first thought in that world is pure being. And that's sort of then is the beginning of all beings. And the Eckhart's being is a version of this. There's an evolution. So I'm just saying that when you don't think properly about being, you conflate them. And Heidegger kind of did that, even in a philosophical sense. But Eckhart is really, in my opinion, he's like pure living it. He's not making these distinctions radical. He is, but it's in what's called purple prose, if anybody wants to look that up. But I want to make this clarification that there's different types of being. The way that Hegel talks about it is in the logical sense. And I want to make this point quickly, that when you talk in a logical sense, when you grasp these mystical concepts, not in the purple prose, but in the actual scientific logical universal logic, you actually do it in the way that Aristotle did it. Hegel gives a lot of credit to Aristotle, where he says, when you grasp the notion of something, that's the true scientific clarity of it. But a notion logically means you have to have three elements always present. And that's, you have to have, it's universal, it's particular, and it's individual. And if you look in this paragraph, what do you see that I underline? You see, I underline that in one paragraph, Hegel's explaining this I with these logical terms. He's putting them all there and telling you how this concept of the I is clear in its notion. He's also introducing this concept of presentedness, where you can kind of have these universal thoughts, but it's not universality. Universals they seem like they can exist in abstraction, like the color blue or an animal. But in order to reflect on them, to sort of know them, to have them present to you, you have to know them. And that requires this universality where you're reflecting on these categories and doing this sublation where it's constantly in motion, integrating itself. Okay, so this is what's different about Hegel. And I'm kind of giving you the secret sauce. It took a lot of time to discover this, to figure out that Hegel wasn't talking gibberish. He's not, a lot of people say he's just meaningless verbiage. But when you look for these three elements, they are everywhere. Not just in Hegel's text, but he's saying this is actually happening in the real world, in the fridge that's beside you, in the animals you're looking at in the bush, in the road you're walking on. When you're talking about something logically, you should find it in these terms, in the terms of the notion. And Hegel's doing just that for us. Nobody else, Aristotle started to do that, but he did it in an abstract way. So here's Eckhart. He's living the universal in his particular individual. He's living it. He knows it implicitly, but it's not explicit to himself. In point F, I'm going to bridge here now quickly so we can get to the other points. This profound state that Eckhart is talking about and Heidegger is catching on to, you don't stop here, okay? This is just the beginning of this sort of mystical breaking out of your carnality and ordinary thinking. It's a beginning point. It kind of opens up this super expansive realm, but there's nothing yet really in it. Like that's why Eckhart says, I entered this world where there's no thought, or he was above the thoughts. It's just the beginning, okay? You do fill out this realm, but you don't fill it out with these random contingent particular thoughts, these sensuous thoughts. You fill them out the way Hegel did it. You fill them out with these absolute perfect thoughts, the ones that Plato was talking about that we could never know. But Hegel says we can know this. And you fill out this universal realm, this beginning, with these types of thoughts. Okay, so it's really hard to grasp these thoughts. This is where Eckhart is trying to grasp them. But he's stuck in what's called Stoic Consciousness to Hegel. Once you sublate the master-slave dialectic, once you are no longer a slave to your own desires, the master doesn't even have to be outside of you. It can be inside of you as your own like limited self. Once you sublate that and you get into this new beginning, it's where Stoic consciousness began, I think after Aristotle. I think that was the next. It's in the Roman period, in the Roman Empire, they were grappling with these dialectics where the slaves were saying, oh, there's something the master can't control about me. And it is this realm of pure thought. This is outside of the external master. It's outside of my own desires. Because the external master keeps the slave's desires in check. They can't do whatever they want in their particularity. So it forces them into that kind of place where Eckhart is. but it's in a much more primitive way. Eckhart is actually, because he's a modern man, he's developed his theoretical spirit. And he's not informal Stoicism, not the historical version where it first actually emerged into contingent human history. He's actually starting that. He's kind of like gone past implicitly and he's returning explicitly back to it, but with all this extra stuff, all this extra baggage sort of in his mind. And so in modern Stoicism, I think what we have is a sublation of Stoicism into the next stage, which is reason. And reason is where I think we're the beginnings of reason, filling out this universality, this universal domain with these absolute thoughts is what we're trying to do as a species right now. But there's a peaceful way to do it, and there's a not so peaceful way. So with 10 minutes left, I will try and cover the last two lessons. We sort of realize the problem of Stoicism is that it's not determinate enough. It doesn't grasp the notion, the universal, the particulars, the individuals and everything, and then link them in the logical order that Hegel does. This is why Hegel kind of sublated them. He saw their truth, and he starts going beyond while preserving their truth. So you can even see in a direct quote that he says Stoicism, it has nothing determined. So determination is really important. It's what you can know. So the interesting thing is once you sort of start sublating Stoic consciousness, you can start grasping what Eckhart is really saying in a more profound way. Lesson 2 is trying to explain the logical order of this experience you have when you're in this universal state. This universal state has this presence to it. And the second lesson is the present moment is all you have, Eckhart says. Okay, well, what does presence mean? This is going to be pretty quick here. Maybe I'll do another session which explains it more in depth. But in the dictionary, I put the dictionary definitions there. You can see there's a trend. There's like immediacy is a common term. There's a kind of attitude to it, a calmness. There's this idea that when you're present, you have a presentation, you have a representing, you have knowledge there. When something is present, it is known. It's known to be there in a certain place and time. And in some ways, Hegel says that Jacob Boehm, who we talked about in the previous session, he was not able to arrive at this free presentation of the idea. There was something that wasn't present in him in the logic. And that was that he couldn't break out of the sensuous symbols. He's kind of doing the same thing Eckhart was. He was experiencing the logic implicitly in himself. He was in that universality, but when he tried to present it, it wasn't explicit enough to him. He couldn't actually free himself of the sensuous symbols to grasp the actual true universality and the logic of the idea, the whole concrete totality. So presence comes along with knowledge. And it's this immediate knowledge. Presence is the immediate moment. It is the sublation of the past and future. It is kind of like the here and now. It's even the sublation of the here and there. When we grasp this total knowledge, something incredible happens to us. You like, remember those absolute thoughts that fill up the universal realm? When you are doing what Hegel does, those become explicit to you. So these are the same but different than the particular drives. The particular drives are sort of this random, contingent, irrational way of it working its way through nature. You can grasp them in their perfect order. That's what science is. When you grasp these thoughts and they become present to you, they lift you into this universal realm of the Stoics. But you can now not just be in that realm like the Hindus, like om, om, om. You get back to pure being, and you kind of sit there in a sort of eternal stability. You actually gain this. You can think in that way. You can think in an absolute way. Your thoughts become absolute thoughts in emotion. And this is where it starts to become profound, where the mystical and the scientific actually become this incredible presence. Instead of a night-like void, things become clear. You start getting this presence of mind in the definitions above. This is what Plato, the Stoics, Kant, everybody before Hegel couldn't really do. They couldn't make these absolute thoughts thinkable. They just said they were always at beyond. But that's what the science of logic is. It looks so boring when you're reading it, but that's the absolute thoughts in their right order. When you grasp them immediately, it lifts your consciousness to this incredible level of presence that Spinoza kind of calls the perspective of eternity. You can look back on your life and things around you, around Dasein, from this perspective and not get brought in. But it doesn't mean you're emotionless like the Hindus that are meditating in the lotus position. You can live your life in this way. And that's what Hegel was doing. That's what we can do. And we can start sublating everything in this universal logic and sort of get rid of this polemical fragmentation that makes living painful, or at least more painful than it has to be at our current level of consciousness. I put a quick note in here about Heidegger. He's big on presence. I kind of applied Hegel's logic to his symbols, presence at hand, readiness at hand. Here's the order that I think it should go in. The presence that we're talking about with pure being, like pure being in the science of logic, the very, very beginning is like pure presence, but it's immediate presence. I think it's what Heidegger is calling readiness at hand. But there's also immediated presence, which is the I that Eckhart's talking about. And then there's absolute presence, which is absolute spirit, where I think Eckhart is getting to, but is this kind of sublation of the readiness and the presently at handness. This is what subspecies aeternatus kind of feels like, aeternitatis. So when you grasp this kind of presence, it's really profound. This is what the mystics are talking about. You can grasp it logically. That's what the rest of the paragraphs are talking about. The third lesson is very quick. Once you grasp this kind of presence in the world, this kind of freedom from yourself, this kind of eternity in yourself, you don't make this mistake that all human beings are sort of making right now. It's the third lesson. It's kind of like a surrender to the now. It's an acceptance of what is, but it's not a naive acceptance. It's just not falling into the first abstract negation so that you can get to a sublation. I put a direct paragraph here of Hegel saying this. We're not making this up. There's something called a genuine infinite and a bad infinite. What Eckhart is getting to here is the logical movement of the bad infinite, where what you resist persists. Hegel says here in the underline, when you're fleeing from something, it's conditioning you. You're not actually free from it, and you never will be, because it's always going to be there. You can try and cancel it like a polemical moment, but the truth is you have to go into it, find its truth, identify it with it, integrate it, and sublate it so that you can move with it in an ideal way. That's genuine freedom. That's the point of presence, is to allow you to rise above that abstract negation and get to this sublation. Remember, universal sublation is where the Peace Prize will win. The Nobel Peace Prize will be won, and our lives will enter this sort of blessedness, if you're religious, but also the scientific kind of peace, this higher truth. Okay, so I kind of covered it all really quickly. If you want to join us in the discussions, we're going to head over to our discussion chat. If you want to post your questions online, I'll get to them in the Hegelians Who Want to Change the World. There's a group there to do that. But if you want to start joining this kind of movement now in a practical way and finding out where is your level of clarity, where are you in this I, this mystical, universal, and all this, Stoic Consciousness, there's a quiz we put there where you can tell us your wisdoms and we can start sublating with you. So tomorrow we're going to pick up, okay, we're mystical, great, but can we actually be truly scientific? Like you're saying logic here. Let's get into logic more tomorrow. Let's also get into a little more fun. This is a little bit dry, but when you work on it in practice, it becomes a living, almost childlike experience. It's a wise childlike experience where you're wise, you're mature, and you have this kind of freedom. So if you're interested in what I said, join me in 2 days.
So did we just click on that Zoom link that's in the chat and we'll go into the meeting immediately?
Yeah, we'll go there right after this. I think you just click it and this will close and then we'll end up there.
Okay.
Okay, guys, thanks for coming. Stay sublating and we'll catch you next time.
Click it now. Click it now. Don't wait till the meeting's over.